Hey everyone, here we are, season 6 of the Resilient Pastor Podcast, and we're kicking it off with a live recording that I did with Sharon and Rich, and the three of us were talking about the challenges that ministry places upon marriages. So some of you may have been part of that webinar, some of you might have missed it, but here it is for all of you to listen in on the challenges of marriage and ministry.
Well, today we're talking about marriage and ministry today. And really, we're asking a couple of questions. How can pastors and church leaders handle the unique challenges that ministry places on our marriages? And so we want to offer not just some good reflection, but some practical, actionable steps that leaders can take to safeguard their relationships, deepen them so that our homes, our marriages, our families really are thriving, are healthy and all that. And so if you are a regular podcast listener, it's going to be a bit different in terms of our format today. And so instead of bringing on a guest, we'll have an extended roundtable together, the three of us. We'll be talking about, the topic of marriage and the unique dynamics of being in ministry as a married person. And then we're going to end with some audience Q&A. And so if you have any questions as we're going, feel free to drop it in the chat as we go, and then we're going to have some time for that at the end. Love this dynamic of being able to connect with you live right now, and so it's going to be a great time.
So good, man. Amazing. All right. Well, as we kind of frame this, I just wanted to mention there's a bit of new data from Barna here on marriage and ministry, and it's kind of a sneak peek on some of our year 3 research that was actually collected last month. I mean, so this is really kind of hot off the press. It's not going to be released until early next year, but we just wanted to share a few of these things with you. Okay. So first of all, only 1 in 3 married pastors say that they are very satisfied with how they are navigating marriage and ministry together. So that's a third, which means 2/3 are kind of not quite there. There's some dissatisfaction maybe, or neutrality about how they're navigating it. And then 51% of married pastors today say that their marriage has gone through significant ups and downs. I mean, we were talking about this before, and Rich, you were like, man, shouldn't that be higher? And then let me just read a couple more. 45% go so far as to say they actually feel a sense of guilt about the impact that ministry is having on their marriage, which that's real, and that's honest. And this stat actually has increased 7 percentage points in the last year. So in other words, it was 38%, of married pastors say they feel a sense of guilt. Now it's 45. And then the final one to share with you is that, and maybe it all kind of leads up to this, is that perhaps this is why 1 out of 4 admit that they're actually currently experiencing some notable conflicts in their marriage right now, and maybe it's related to this stuff. So I would like to just kind of get the ball rolling, and maybe with the open-ended question of all open-ended questions is, what do you think are some of the challenges that ministry uniquely, or maybe not uniquely, but particularly places on marriage?
Well, I mean, when I think of this, I think there is the weight and the stress that's connected to 2 things. I think number 1, it's just the legitimate stress and weight of being in this role, as well as the unreasonable standards that are set for former leaders, especially in the church. And I think it's these 2 things here: the legitimate weight and the unreasonable standards. I think the legitimate standards is that our lives are to model something different about what marriage is, about Christ's love for the church. And as leaders, we are uniquely positioned to be a model of that. And then there's teaching in the New Testament that around the idea that, how we manage our household is very connected to our leadership in the church. I think these are very real truths that we have to wrestle with. But because of these 2 biblical ideas, there's just a weight of integrity, of health. But then there's unreasonable and unrealistic weight that's put on married Christian leaders about having a strong marriage all the time, which is why that stat of 51%, I'm curious as to why it's not higher, because Rosie and I are going to be married 19 years in January. We've had plenty of ups and downs. I think that's called life. And so the unreasonable standard that you have to have however we define a strong marriage all the time, and often that's one without conflict or stress or disappointment. I think that's what makes it very challenging. And then very practically, I think, and Sharon, I'm curious to hear what you say about this, or about anything else. I think it's our role as ministry leaders, and this is not unique to us, but so much of our work is oriented around the rhythms and the schedules of others. And
Mhm.
so if
Mhm.
we're not careful, the commitments that we have to our families can be compromised because of the unwieldy nature of time and scheduling and ministry spaces. So it takes a level of thoughtfulness, and that's just a lot of work.
Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah, I think you make a really good point, Rich. Going back to the stress of the job, I think it's important to name there are certain jobs that you can work the same amount of hours, but what you are holding is heavier, and
Mhm.
ministry is not the
Mhm.
only one. We live in an area where there's
Yeah.
multiple hospitals, and so we have a
Yep.
number of doctors who work with, children who are have cancer. What they're holding is not the
Yeah.
same as someone who is working in just kind of a 9 to 5 job where they can just clock
Mm.
out. It's the difference between
Mhm.
holding 1 pound for an hour versus 100 pounds for an hour. And so
That's
I
good.
think just acknowledging that what we hold every day is incredibly heavy. But I'm also noticing just in the chat the number of people who are talking about the lack of boundaries. And
Mm.
one thing that we were discussing before we even got on is why did that percentage point, like the guilt over
Mm.
how ministry is affecting their marriage, why did that jump up so quickly? 7 percentage points. That's
Mm.
significant. And
Mm.
I was speculating. I wondered if, even though we're almost 5 years out from the pandemic, but that really being home and doing ministry from home really just erased any boundaries around our family. And I'm wondering if we're seeing kind of the downstream effect of that. But I do think
Mm.
because it's easy to legitimize, especially when identity and self-worth gets bound up in feeling like I need to not just be Jesus to people, but be Jesus for people,
Mm.
essentially. It makes it really easy to stop having boundaries around your family. And so I think a lot of, and I'm just seeing so many of you name that this
Mm.
is what makes it really, really difficult is there isn't a safe zone. Like there's
Yeah.
no refuge anymore if you don't have
Mm.
those boundaries. So that's really difficult as well.
Mm.
Yeah. Hey, man. So absolutely yes and amen to all that. And the thing that I think about, maybe related to this is in ministry. I live in a context here where there's lots of entrepreneurs, and so there's some similarities in the weight that entrepreneurs
Yeah.
carry, maybe, and pastors do, because it's not a strict 9 to 5 thing. You're carrying the weight of other people's jobs and other people's hopes and dreams and all of that stuff. But there is a difference. If in the corporate world, if you happen to lose your temper or chew someone out, they go, that's okay. If you do that as the pastor, you have failed to be an icon of Christ. And
Mm.
and I think this is the thing that goes all the way back. I think it was Irenaeus who said the bishop is meant to be a sign of the church. So you are an icon of Christ, and so you are a representative of this spiritual leader. So I think personally, what I have experienced over the years is it takes an extraordinary amount of attentiveness to the Lord and to my
Mm.
own inner dynamics to be well regulated and to have the fruit of the spirit of self control in work context and ministry conversations. So everybody at work, for the most part, thinks that I'm so sweet and kind and listening and non-reactive. And I come home and I go, and I just laugh and I think my kids might not describe me as non-reactive. My wife would not describe me as not. And I think this is the one of the challenges is sometimes on the one hand, you could say that's a good thing. A counselor might say, oh, it's a good sign that you feel safe with your family to kind of let your guard down. On the
Mm.
other hand,
Mm.
I feel that that's a place where I have to be careful not to let them pay the price for all of the stress I've been holding in throughout the day and then become overly sensitive or reactive when I'm at home, you
Mm.
know.
Which is why I think one of the things that I've tried, and maybe at the end, a little practice. The other day I came home. It's very hard not to have any buffer between if I'm coming from the office and coming home,
Mm,
and just going right into home life. And there are times where for me, I'm like, can I just get 10 minutes
hmm
to just go into the bedroom or chair and just
Yeah.
breathe
Yeah.
and just
Yeah.
recenter myself here. Because if I'm not doing that,
Mhm.
they don't want me around. And so even the
Mhm.
space of just like, I need buffer and margin to even transition from one space into another.
Yeah, that's good. And Sharon, you and Ike, you're both full time at the church. You're co-pastoring this. I mean, where's
Oh,
the
it's easy
buffering
for them. Oh,
there?
they got it, man. It's just,
I mean, where's talk to me about that.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, this becomes even more complicated when you are both on staff at church. And we've had to, and we're going to get into this more later, but we've had to really be aggressive around boundaries around work, especially when it comes to our home. But the other area where this is played out, and this is, I know this won't apply to everyone who's not on staff with your spouse, but it's been tricky whenever we disagree around matters of the church.
mm,
It's really easy for me, even when we're doing it, in the office, we're in like the zone where we're supposed to be having these conversations. It's really tricky because I start to think like, okay, which hat do I have on right now? Like, do I have on my
Mhm.
wife hat or do I have on my,
Mhm.
co-pastor hat? And at some point I started to realize that that was a really problematic way of
mm,
compartmentalizing different aspects of our relationship.
Mhm.
And I think I had this moment of clarity where I realized, I would never say that about my kids. Like, I would never say, which hat does my son need me to have on right now? The mother hat or the pastor hat? Like, it's
mm,
only ever mother. And I kind of reached this point of realizing I don't ever take off my wife hat with my husband. And so even
Mm.
when I am at work, I think very often what was happening was we were letting work kind of seep into the home when really the primary role for us has to be as a married couple. And so when even when we are disagreeing, I'm often thinking it's easy for me to go into fight to win mode here because we're talking about the church, we're talking about
mm,
vision, it's like
Mhm.
kingdom
Mhm.
stakes. And so I can
Mhm.
justify like it's I have to win because of eternity. Like that's kind of the way that you
Mhm.
start thinking. But at some point, realizing like I can win this argument, but it's going to cost my marriage. And is it really
Mhm.
worth that? And the answer is always no. And
mm,
so that's a shift that I've really had to make and that Ike has made as well. It's not that I'm just constantly like backing down, but we've both realized like, honestly, our church can come and go, but we want our marriage to last. And so that has to be the primary category for us.
I think that's really insightful, Sharon. Holly and I have been married 23 years, and it was probably years 13, 14 that felt like a lot of things kind of came to the surface. And just if I just insert 30 seconds here of my own little theory of how it is for a lot of couples, opposites tend to attract. So your first, 5 to 7 years of marriage, it's all kind of fun. Like it's sort of like this is a great, we love the way that we're different, the
mm,
way that we challenge one another. And then right around year 7, you start to go, you know what? Those things about you kind of bug me, or actually they kind of hurt me. But you make an uneasy truce because probably around that time you're having kids and you're just trying to survive. So you go through another 7 years or so of just trying to survive, and there's these things there, but you're like, we're not really going to explore beneath the surface. And for us, it was after that second lap of 7, so around 14, that we're like, okay, the kids are out of like diaper and toddler mode. We have enough bandwidth to see one another, and then we go, okay,
mm,
wait a minute, what's actually going on here? And we read a book on a vacation that just my wife and I went on. And it's called How We Love by Milan and Kay Yerkovich, I think. And it's really about attachment theory and marriages. And I think this is really helpful, specifically even for pastor marriages. That they identify that attachment actually feels like comfort, and the thing that we're longing for in our spouse is this desire to be comforted. So think about what we've
mm,
just named: the stresses of ministry life, the pressures of ministry life, and then you turn to your spouse, and whether you know to ask for it or not, what you're looking for is some measure of comfort, but what you get is correction or feedback or
mm,
coaching or and you go, wait a minute, that's not it. And I think there's both parts here where I had to really grow in recognizing what's the longing underneath this frustration, what's the fear underneath this frustration, and how can I turn that into a question to ask of my wife. and then you kind of go from there, as opposed to these unarticulated expectations that come from an internal box of desires and fears that are only manifesting in frustration, disappointment, and irritation. So anyway, there's probably a whole lot more there. And Rich, you're going to talk about, I don't know, exploring the beneath the surface or whatever.
No, I was gonna, I mean, talk about really the connected to that in terms of just the work-life balance
Mm, mm,
that, or I mean, in some ways that I call like the myth of work-life balance. I'm not sure if it's even possible here. Maybe I'm leading too much, leading my hand too much here. But Barna has studied this idea of just work-life balance for pastors. So talking about stress and the
mm,
various stressors of our lives.
mm, mm,
And the majority of pastors have said that ministry duties, family time is challenged. 73% of folks have said this. And I think we all can identify with this here. And so, in terms of rhythms of like establishing rhythms, you and your spouse, with regard to your life as and ministry, anything that you've done around this idea, or how have you even thought about work? Is there a different way that
mm.
you've thought about work-life balance as it relates to marriage and ministry?
So one idea I want to share that actually comes from my husband, Ike, as we've, rounded the bend. We've been married for 15 years now. And so that theory you had, Glenn, that definitely tracks with us. That hit home. And so we've been, especially leading a church plant through the pandemic, we had a lot to unpack. And one thing that Ike said sometime in the last year that I've repeated so many times because it was really beautiful is that for a long time, we treated our marriage like a resource to exploit for
Mm,
ministry. And he kind of
mm,
compared it to when a timber company goes into a beautiful forest and then chops it down to use it for lumber. And he said, I don't want our marriage to be like that anymore.
wow.
Instead, I want to
Wow.
treat our marriage as a national park that you
Mm,
preserve for its beauty so that I know, right? That you
Ike.
then
Wow.
invite people in to enjoy. And when he said that, I thought it was so beautiful and such a great vision for marriage. And that
Mm,
was a really great turning point for us and just how we think about our marriage, because obviously your marriage is this echo
mm,
of Eden. And so there is an
mm,
extent to which you are exercising dominion together, but not by, chopping Eden down and,
mm.
selling its parts, so to speak.
So
And so
good.
making sure you
Mm.
are like really guarding it, really
Sheesh.
tending to it. And so for us, this has played out in a number of different ways in terms of like, what do these boundaries look like? Because a number of you have asked, like, what do these boundaries look like? And we've always been really religious around date night, and so we've had to sometimes get creative about that. Like every single Friday night is our date night, and that also kind of kicks off our Sabbath. But one recent change that we have made, so we as co-pastors, we are constantly talking to other couples, asking how they're navigating this because it's kind of new territory. And early on, discovered a lot of the answers we were giving were particular to that couple based on their
Mm,
particular personalities, their particular giftings, how it shook out in ministry. And so we started asking, okay, we need universal principles. Like, what is universally true, regardless of your
Mm.
personality and your gifting? And over the summer, we had dinner with a friend of ours. She leads with her husband. And one rule that she said that they had arrived at was no feedback about work at all.
Mm.
None.
Mm.
And I think I like twitched a little. I was like, none. And, I still don't know. I still don't know if that feels too extreme, but as I've
mm,
processed it, what I eventually settled on was realizing that the truth underneath it is that ministry is such a high feedback job that we are
mhm,
constantly being given feedback. Like you go to work, you go to dinner with a family in the church, and you don't know, is this for fun or is this because there's something they wanted to slide in, to give you feedback on. And so because you're constantly being given evaluations on your work, you need safe zones. Like you need safe spaces where I can let my guard down and I'm not going to be evaluated. And we've realized that has to be our home. Like it really has to be, including as well as just like our off hours. Like if we're on our dates, if we're with our family doing something, but especially I want our home to be a refuge from that demand. And so that has taken an incredible amount of Holy Spirit empowered self-control on my part. My husband is really, really good about this. Something will pop into my head and I want to say it. But it has really helped our marriage. It has really like refreshed it and restored it. And we're not fighting about some random church thing on a Friday night when we should be out having fun together. And so that has been a boundary that has been huge for us.
That's so good, man. I
That's
love that.
great.
And I'm still reflecting on national park versus like fodder for lumber. I mean, Ike, what an image. You guys need to write on that. The forest and the trees, echoing Eden in your marriage by Sharon and Ike Miller, man. Let's go. Let's go. I'll be your agent.
I heard that
Um,
title. I heard that title. Echoing. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, I mean, the healthy rhythms thing, I think rhythms are seasonal, and I think it's really
Yeah.
important to recognize that because life is dynamic. And I think sometimes we get discouraged by rhythms because we try to lock in something for too long of a time. And so one of the things that was recommended to Holly and I a long time ago, and we've practiced for about 12 or 13 years now, is going away on a retreat once a year. Some years we've been able to do it twice a year, once every 6 months, and then some years where it's been so busy we've not been able to do the overnight. We've just done a day away. And so I just want to encourage you. There's ways to right size this to your own schedule, and we talk about this in our book, The Intentional Year. But there is such an important thing to, as a couple, stop and reflect back together. I think so often we're dealing with the urgent and the pressing and the now or the next, the now and the next, that we don't actually stop and go, wait a minute, let's just stop and pause and think about what we've just come through. And that's as much a part of a healthy marriage as the other stuff. And I think partly there's a psychology reason for this. The psychologists sometimes talk about our brain being like Teflon when it comes to positive things, it just bounces off. And it's like Velcro when it comes to negative things. I think the ratio is you need 5-to-1 positive to negative just to feel good about your marriage. And I think part of the goal of that retreat, even for us, is to take time to affirm one another and to affirm what you've been through, to go, hey, you know what, I see you. You've come through this season. It's been really tough for you. You can rejoice together. You can affirm one another. You can grieve together. And then there is a reevaluating of rhythms. When our kids were younger and more into different activities and they weren't driving and all that, we had to really map out, okay, for this fall semester, like what does it look like and what's our upper limit of how many evenings out? And our upper limit is always somewhere around 3 or 4. And then what's our baseline of how many? And so you build these in, and we say to people a lot of times, it's not because you're going to have like machine-like adherence to it. You're most certainly not. But it's so that you can have
Yeah.
a certain navigational points, coordinates in the map. And when the winds come and when the waves come, as they most certainly will, it may knock you off course, but it won't knock you that far off course. And that's the whole point of intentionality. Is intentionality puts some grid points, some navigational points on your horizon, so that you can, if you're 1 degree, 2 degrees, 10 degrees off, it's not the same as aimlessly being tossed around because life is just so stressful right now. And that's the newsflash. It's not just a season. It's going to be stressful in different
Yeah.
ways for the rest of your lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Glenn's really well said. And, to add to that, the work-life balance I already mentioned, I don't know if that's the best way to think about what we do, because I don't think we ever achieve equal balance. Work-life balance seems to be like where the scales are equal here. I think in our line of work, there's seasons and the rhythms. And
Yes.
I think that's what we
Yes.
have to pay attention to. And so, for us, for Rosie and I, and Rosie's the one who's helped me with this, because I used to believe for a number of years that our time our planning was always oriented around the church calendar. That there was nothing that could be done around that there. And so having our time oriented around church rhythms
Yes.
exclusively and not our values, our hopes, our preferences for our own family has been an adjustment for me to make. Now, of course, Easter, Christmas, some of the high holy days, just like, this is what I do. I'm at church.
Mhm.
But that throughout the course of the year, for many years, I'm like, I don't know if I can go there because we have a retreat, or I don't know if we can do this here because we have an elders meeting. And
Mhm.
Rosie would ask the question constantly, like, when do we get to have first dibs on certain things here?
Mm.
Because for
So
many
good.
years, it's like, okay, here's what we're doing with the church, and then okay, we get the leftovers. And so a big shift for us has been around doing the hard work of planning months in
Mhm.
advance
Mhm.
around family rhythms. Now, this has been the most
Mhm.
challenging thing for me for a number of different reasons, but Rosie and I have a finance meeting and a calendar meeting every month. And then we have a larger meeting where we're looking at the entire year, winter
Mhm.
break, spring break,
Yep.
summer. What are the
Yep.
thing? Where are the spaces that seems
Same.
reasonable for us to say, you know what, we're going to do this and then orient our lives? But it took me a number of years and lots of frustration. And sadly, I don't think I loved Rosie well enough in this area because I just thought, no, no, no. All of our lives have to be oriented around the church calendar. And then I
Mhm.
realized, no, actually, that doesn't have to happen that way. And
That's
so it was
right.
very liberating when I came to that realization. Rosie knew it, 20 years ago. We've been married for 19 years. She knew it
Right.
20 years ago. I'm just coming around to it here. So that's been an important area of development for me and change for me.
That's
Uh,
so
I
good.
wanted
Oh, go ahead. Can
I
I just
wanted to
say
add,
one? No,
yeah, go for
go
it.
ahead. No, no, no. Okay. Schedule first what matters most. That was a phrase we heard at this like family camp thing that I went to kicking and screaming that Holly's like, we're going to this family camp. Like, no, we're not. But the one gold nugget from it was schedule first what matters most. So there you go. That's what you're saying.
There you
Sorry.
go. There you go.
I love that. I wanted to echo to something that you said, Glenn, about this all being seasonal, because
Mm,
all three of us are pretty much we're on the other side of having really little kids. And
mm,
I want to say if you are in the season where your children are very, very little, that
mm,
this is unique. It's a uniquely challenging season, that it is
yeah.
actually, it can be very hard on your marriage,
Mm,
especially just speaking as a woman.
Mm,
The multifaceted demands that having small children puts on your entire being
mm,
often translates in your ability
mm,
to be intimate with, to connect with your spouse. And
mhm,
so I want to say, especially anyone who is listening with, small children and feeling like, is it always going to be this way? I just want to say it's not always going to be this way.
mm,
And for those of you who are on the other side, if you just want to in the chat, like, show support and say
mhm.
it's not always going to be this way, because that
So
can be
good.
really discouraging when you feel
Mm,
like what happened to those early years of marriage or dating when we were
mm,
mm,
just staring into each other's eyes, and now we're basically just coworkers because we're like parenting together all the time.
mm.
That is very challenging, but it's seasonal. It's a limited
So
season, and so
good.
I want you to have that grace for yourself as well.
mm, mm.
Sharon, I needed that advice, 10, 15 years ago. Cause I think you do kind of like stress out and you go, oh no, what are we becoming?
Hmm.
And I needed
Yeah.
someone to take me on the shoulders and, look me in the eye and say, hey, it's just settle down. It's okay. Like this is,
Mm,
and I do think there's something so beautiful about remembering that. And one of the convicting things for me as a dad is to remember too that the surest legacy I will have is my wife and our children.
mm,
And what I mean by that is you might have a legacy at your church where people remember you and all that. That's great. But your kids are going to be talking about you in therapy one way or another, like like there's no way around that one. Like you are going to have an impact on them
mhm.
and on your spouse. And it has helped me to think in terms of my replaceable roles and my irreplaceable roles,
Yeah.
like all of my relationally defined roles, i.e., son, husband, father, brother, all of my relationally defined roles are irreplaceable.
Mm, mm.
Someone could say, well, maybe not if you screw up your marriage too bad. Okay, I get that. But they're mostly irreplaceable, and it's the non-relational ones that I need to prioritize rightly.
Talking about leadership development, culture, and boundaries, because I wonder how much, to what degree of the stress that's on us, because we have, to your point, Glenn, have maybe taken on a level of weight and responsibility that's not always ours to carry. And so I just wonder about, like, for those who are leading, whether in a small context, and I realize the challenge of those who are in a smaller leadership context. Um, for me, boundaries emerge because of a culture of shared leadership and responsibility. And while I recognize this can be a challenge for smaller churches, I'm just wondering, like, to what degree does training and empowering, whether it's one person or a team, uh, the impact that that has on our marriages, on
Mm,
our family?
mm,
Uh,
mm,
any thoughts around that?
Mm. Well, I can speak as we have a smaller church, and still delegation has been huge for us. It's something that we're constantly training our staff around as well. And it has been really interesting to watch some of our staff that have struggled with this, and then the ripple effects when they're unwilling to delegate, when they're unwilling
Mm,
to share leadership with other people. Usually on at the surface level, it's not because of lack of trust, it's actually because of care. They
mm,
don't want to burn out other people around them. And
mm,
so one thing that we constantly talk about is we want to cultivate a culture where people know there will be no retribution for saying no. Like we want to cultivate a culture where we
mhm.
can make big
Yes.
asks, and then people feel the freedom to say no if they can't do it. But also to say,
Mm,
like, it's not your responsibility to guard the
mm,
marriages of other people
yeah.
on staff. Like, they're grown. They have the maturity to know what their own boundaries are, especially if we have that
Hmm.
kind of a culture. And so that is something, I think that's a really great perspective, Rich, that in order to not be carrying everything, that means we also have to have a culture of delegation and sharing
mm,
responsibility, and calling people up as well. And so that's something that we've really worked hard to cultivate at our church.
mm,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Rich, I know you do this with your team, where part of your oversight meetings, your one-on-ones, is to ask them about their rule of life.
mm,
And I know you've told the story about the one thing you could get fired for, your predecessor told you, was that if you didn't take a Sabbath, and I think those are ways to kind of build it in the culture as far as raising up a team. I mean, one of the things I think as a lead pastor, you're always thinking about is, are we right sizing our vision to the resources we have right now?
mm,
And I understand some people are kind of like, hey, let's lead with faith, let's lead with vision and trust God for the provision. And yeah, okay, maybe, but I think sometimes you have to be realistic and to go, we're trying to do too many things and it's putting too much of a strain on the
mm,
team. We don't have the team to do this, and so you sort of accept that. And I do find myself having to have that inner wrestle of like, gosh, we could do this, we could do this, and to say, well, the only people that are going to carry that are X, Y, and Z, and that's going to add more strain
mm.
on their
Yeah,
marriages. And so there is a certain acceptance of that restraint, you know.
yeah, limits. Yeah.
Yeah. Rich, you do a lot of work on interior examination, and you've helped people a lot. I mean, in your work on kind of unpacking family of origin stuff. I'm just so
Mm.
curious, like marriage and ministry. Obviously, this applies to more than just ministry marriages, but like, why is it people in ministry, maybe we don't pay attention to that very thing that, maybe we're even telling others to do? Or is there a
Mm.
particular way that our family of origin stuff comes to play, in ministry marriages?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons we don't do interior examination, I think usually for three reasons. It's the pace of life that we live. It's the particular theology we've inherited from others
Mm,
around doing that kind of work, and it's fear. And so I think life gets so there's a Ron Rolheiser talked about a pathological busyness that pervades our lives, and I think this is very true of ministry leaders and pastors. A pathological busyness. The pace is just unrelenting, and so
Mm.
to take time to do this is very difficult. Then there's just the theology behind it that informs. To what degree is interior examination, is that navel gazing, is that being too self preoccupied? And so I think
Mm.
some just unhealthy theology keeps folks from
Mm.
actually looking within. But it's really the fear, isn't it? It's what am I going to
Mm.
find there? To actually look within and to wrestle with my idols and wrestle with my wounds and wrestle with the interior scripts that I've carried for so many years. I don't know if I want to do that. Will I be able to get out of it if I actually go down
Mhm.
in there? And I think that's what leads to so much of the challenges, I think, as human beings. But then
Mhm.
when you compound what we do as leaders, leading others, the kind of character that's required of us to embody what we're preaching, or to wrestle faithfully with it. I've said in different contexts that integrity is not living something perfectly, but wrestling with something faithfully. And we're not talking about perfection. We're talking about congruence. And in order to do that, it just takes a lot of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm not sure to what degree that's prioritized in most
Mm.
leadership cultures.
Okay, Sharon, kick us off with the first of 3 keys to a resilient marriage.
Yeah, so we wanted to end it just kind of with 3 key takeaways for you guys, especially for those of you who maybe have joined in the middle. But to summarize, one of the main points I majored on was just boundaries around feedback. Just this idea that your marriage is not a forest to be chopped down for lumber, but it's a national park to be preserved for its beauty so people can enjoy it. And practically speaking, one of the ways that has played out for us is specifically boundaries around our home, that is a safe zone. It's a refuge zone where we know that we can come home, or if it's just you're the only one on staff, that you can come home and know this is a place where I'm not going to be given feedback on my job. That has been a really helpful boundary for us.
Mm.
Well said. Really well said, Sharon.
Wow. Really well said.
For me, what I would add is wrestling, and I've already alluded to it, wrestling with our family of origin scripts. And some folks, I put in the chat, like one of the books that have helped me around that from Ronald Richardson on becoming a healthier pastor. It's probably one of the best intro books around family of origin. But a big part of our formation is paying attention to the scripts and patterns that have impacted us, especially when we're talking about difficult matters like conflict, money. For us, leisure is a big thing for us. Parenting,
Mm.
sexual intimacy. I think family of origin scripts. So I mean, so having that, like, how have I been formed by my family? This is just a good question around this. How have I been
Mm.
formed by my family in this area, and how
Mhm.
is that showing up right now? I think
Mhm.
that's been a really important part of Rosie and our conversation. Whenever we find ourselves in distress around something, not seeing something in the
Mm.
same way, I've come back to that question on a regular basis, just to name, like, I'm responding like this right now because I know I've been shaped in this way. And I'm not saying that that's always a bad. Sometimes it's a bad thing. Sometimes I shouldn't. But
Mhm.
just naming that out loud has just
Yeah.
been a really helpful question for us, especially as we're navigating conversations that can be pretty anxiety producing.
Mhm. That's so good. I'm sitting here thinking, how do I summarize what I really want to say? And I think we can say it this way, to move from communication to connection. And what I mean by that is that the goal of a marriage is really for 2 lives to become one. And so you could go through navigating the challenges of a schedule. You could go through navigating the demands of a calendar and stresses, and still miss out on the connection, the real
Yeah.
deep connection with one another. And that's the thing we don't want. We are partners, but we're not only partners. And so maybe to put a little bit more color to this picture, the word comfort is a really helpful one, that part of what it looks like, part of what we're looking for in our marriages is comfort from one another, deep comfort. But that requires, in the comfort seeker, it requires a kind of awareness to go, you know what, here is my beneath the surface longings, fears, some of them valid, some of them exaggerated. And then in the comfort giver, it requires a non-reactive, non-anxious kind of approach to say, okay, you're a little bit stressed and thrown off, and I'm not going to meet you in that and spiral with you. I'm going to listen and figure out, and so I think that's such a key thing. And then practically what has helped my wife and I move beyond communication towards connection is just to take that time at least once a year, maybe twice a year on a retreat, different than a vacation, different than time with the kids. And I totally appreciate when kids are young that an overnight can be hard. So even if you figure out a way to go 8 to 8, 12 hours away, 6 hours away, whatever, just time to breathe, reflect, journal, connect through reflection and connect through intentional kind of planning. Okay. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. And I know there's a lot of heaviness, there's a lot of weight to this. And we just want to pray God's grace over your lives and over your marriages and over your ministries in Jesus' name. Amen.